The title of presentation, which I proposed to David when he asked me to talk in this summer school, was what makes Russia different from other former empires. I thought of this title because I think it's very pertinent to the current moment. We are all, of course, look at news from the war in Ukraine, for sure, but we're also asking ourselves a question. Why is Russia doing what it is doing in Ukraine, but also what is Russia really doing in Ukraine? So what Russia's kind of ultimate game is. I think it was in this context that it was important to ask a question, which I am asking. Why is Russia so different from other former empires? Because its behaviors is so much different. Okay, we can start briefly by how Russia presents its own actions in Ukraine. As I said, the question for us, for all of us, is what Russia is really doing, and it presents what it is doing very differently. At least three different kind of frameworks in which it presents its actions. On the one hand, we can see this Russia's behavior, Russia's project, as kind of exercise in irredentist nationalism, ethnic nationalism. Some of us have read Putin's article on Ukraine, which says that Ukraine does not really exist. It's a sort of artificial construct. God knows why it was created, that Ukrainians are not a nation, Ukrainians are really Russian. And the objective of irredentist nationalism is that all Russians should live in Russia, and all historically Russian territories should be in Russia. So that's a classic case of irredentist ethnic nationalism. Of course, there is some problem that Ukrainians don't think they are Russians, but okay, who asks Ukrainians? They have to be somehow forced to understand that they are Russians. Especially this justification was pertinent when Russia began its war, when it claimed all of Ukraine, basically. De-sovereignization of Ukraine meant that there should be no Ukraine, it should be part of Russia effectively, but now it's changed its tack, changed its military objectives, it's fighting for Donbass, but again, Donbass is kind of more Russian part of Ukraine or more pro-Russian part of Ukraine, so there Russia, with regards to Donbass, this kind of ethnic, ethno-nationalist justification, irredentist, ethno-nationalist justification is relatively easier to sell. Another justification is paradoxical. It is anti-colonial, basically. Russia is fighting the West. Russia is fighting Western and specifically American imperialism in Ukraine. So, and you also, of course, can find references to this in Putin's speeches or speeches of Russian propagandists. So there is kind of this Western imperialism is represented by American unipolarity. So Americans try to enforce some kind of unipolar order, which means American domination of the world. And Russia is a rebellious country which fights for sovereignty for its own sovereignty, but in general, everybody's sovereignty, China's sovereignty, India's sovereignty, I don't know, Egypt's sovereignty, whatever, in the face of American imperialism. So it uses some kind of this ideas of post-colonial theory, if you wish. It's kind of postmodernist interpretation or self-interpretation, self-presentation of the Russian war. So it's not an empire. So it's not that Russia is an empire, it's America that is empire, and Russia fights against America as an empire, so for sovereignty. Okay, I don't think that's very strong or convincing interpretation, but okay, somebody buys it, I guess, some people. And then there is more simple interpretation that this is basically an imperial war of conquest. Some say colonial war. Timothy Snyder, for instance, a quite famous American historian, wrote an article saying that it's a colonial war. So I use colonial and imperial as synonymous, basically. Somehow word colonial is considered very bad and pejorative, and imperial is not so pejorative, but in effect, this is the same thing. So it is an imperial West, and it's made by imperial aggrandizement. That empires want to be great, they want more territory, and they gain this territory through conquest. And that's what Russia is doing. And I think if we just look at facts, that's real explanation, or that's rather most proper description. Explanation is a different thing, but it's a proper description of what Russia is doing. It's not official narrative of the war, but we hear from Russian intellectuals, kind of pro-Putin intellectuals or imperialist, pro-imperial intellectuals, that, okay, yes, we are an empire. Russians are an imperial nation. We have always been like that. We cannot be otherwise. We cannot, you cannot imagine Russia as just another nation state. So we should accept us as like we are. And all great, and Vladislav Surkov, for instance, who is one of the propagandists of Kremlin, now he may be not so much kind of prominent, but he used to be one of the chief ideologists of Kremlin policies. He wrote an op-ed or essay, whatever you call it, several months before Ukraine war, invasion in Ukraine, saying that this imperial expansion is basically based on the law of physics. He spoke about the second law of thermodynamics, that bodies expand. And so you cannot resist it because it's fixed, right? So does not even depend on Putin's mind, for instance. That's kind of inevitable development. And he also said that Russia was natural direction of expansion would be Ukraine. So it's kind of, I would say, it's very similar to Hitler's idea of Lebensraum, or living space, that country should expand so it has greater space for its own people for living. So it's kind of postmodernist version again of Hitler's idea of Lebensraum. These different, the fact that there are different Russian self-presentations of what it is doing in Ukraine is indicative in itself. I don't want to go deep into analyzing this, but it shows that Russian government is not fully open or fully clear about the nature of what it is doing. So it presents it in a different ways. It looks for different justification. So it may be kind of hedging its ideological bets, as it were. So on the one hand, some Russian intellectuals maybe say defiantly, oh yes, we are imperialists and just accept us as we are. But Russian state says it's not even a war, much less it's not war of conquest, it's just a limited military operation. So as you all know, I guess that it's kind of illegal in Russia to call it a war. So some appearances are still kept. But I will still follow what I said in the beginning, that as a matter of fact, I'm not postmodernist. I don't think that appearances and reality are equal. I think there are appearances and there is also reality. These are two different things. And this, on the face of it, as a fact, it is a traditional war of conquest, something that empires usually do. And that's what Russia is doing. But the question is, why? Why is Russia doing this? And of course, the answer cannot be that Russia is evil. I think what Russia does, it's certainly evil, very evil. And it requires, calls for clear and unequivocal moral condemnation. And it's evil for two reasons. One is kind of humanitarian, because it causes much human suffering, and we see it on television sometimes. But it is also evil in more indirect way, because it undermines international order and make all of us vulnerable. I think Georgia as a country is especially vulnerable, even if there is no war right now, no military operations on the Georgian soil, but it somehow exposes our vulnerability. It exposes vulnerability of other neighbors of Russia. But in general, it exposes everybody's vulnerability, I think, because it makes wars more probable, more possible. So basically what Russia doing is that it sets a precedent that wars of conquest are normal. And if wars of conquest are normal, then it's not only Russia that may carry out such wars of conquest. And some nation may be far from Russia and not particularly afraid of Russia as such, but it may have other aggressive neighbors, potentially aggressive neighbors. And so the world order where wars of conquest become normal are much worse than the world where they are not normal. So they are don't take place. Therefore, Russia makes us all, everybody, everywhere, basically, feeling very unsafe. But yes, so in that sense, it is certainly evil and it cannot be justified, but saying it's evil, okay, it does not help much. So because it does not explain things. It's not about just Putin being a very bad man. There are lots of dictators in the world who are sometimes very nasty people. And I think Putin is quite a nasty person. He's one of those, but all these autocratic regimes don't do wars of conquest. So that's a different category. So that requires some other explanation apart from moral condemnation. The first thing to say is that what Russia is doing is something very unusual, and that made it unexpected. So, and people were caught unaware by this war, especially in the West, I would say. Okay, of course, this war was sort of predicted already a couple of months before it started, but it was predicted based on very overwhelming kind of technical evidence that Russia was amassing its troops on Ukraine's border. So, and Russia was doing things that could only be preparation for war. And in that sense, in the technical sense, it was predicted. But even in that case, you know, until the very end, there were some, I know, hesitations, and people hoped that maybe it's just a blackmail, maybe it's some kind of Russian games. Russia will not really go all the way, again, because it's very unusual. Countries don't do that now, at least. And so politically, it was not predicted. Russia itself, I think, only gradually gathered that resolve, that kind of daring to do this, because that was what it did in Ukraine, was challenging the world order. Certainly, it was challenging the West and Western-led international community. And it took some, you know, daring, as I said, some resolve. And so it went in that direction gradually and gathered this self-confidence. And so the first, it was, of course, 2008 in Georgia, when it attacked Georgia, but it was not openly about Russian expansion. It was in effect, but it was more kind of disguised as protection of minorities from Georgian imperialism, whatever. And Russia did not formally annex any of these territories. And so also international community was concerned, of course, but not everybody saw this as a beginning of some great trend. Somebody blamed kind of impetuous character of Saakashvili for this war, at least in part. So, but now on the hindsight, we can say with confidence that Russia basically tested water in this war. It saw how much it could get away with, and it did get away with this. So it kind of effectively annexed Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But it did not do it so openly. In 2014 in Ukraine, it went to further to a policy of formal annexation of Crimea. It's also manufactured basically a new conflict in Donbass out of a thin air, basically. And there it did not go for formal annexation, but it was still effective, veiled, more thinly veiled, I would say, policy of expansion. And now, and it's also basically got away with that. There were some sanctions, but not very tough. So it could say that it got away with that. And then it went further this year, of course, by announcing its aim to destroy the whole country, and a quite large country at that. And then it kind of reduced its ambition, but still this is a even more open war of territorial expansion and aggrandizement, and then much larger scale than it was before. So there was there is this clear pattern raising the stakes at each stage and being more blatant in undermining certain written or unwritten rules. And this time, unlike previous times, Western powers so recognize that this is a pattern. I think before that, they did not recognize that. And they understood that Russia should be stopped somewhere, because if it gets away with these two, then it will go for more. So it will not stop, and so it should be stopped. It should suffer enough not to be able to continue its policy as it does. So how this will work out, we don't know. Of course, the war is going on, but basically this is the stake in the war. Russia wants to have a successful, victorious war of conquest, but it's not only about just adding to Russia's territory and gathering Russia's lands, but also showing to the West that it's different world, and you cannot impose on us any kind of restrictions. We will do what we consider doing. And the West, on the other hand, wants to bring the world back to normal, as it were, bring the world back to the condition where such wars of expansion, open wars of conquest, are impossible and punished, so punishable. So the objective of the West is to ensure that wars of conquest are thing of the past. And this is basically global stake of the war. There is stake for Ukrainian people, which is very important, of course. What kind of Ukraine there will be, I think we can say with confidence, which we could not say maybe on 25th of February, that Ukraine will certainly be a state, and maybe even stronger state than before the war, but we don't know many other things, how big this state will be, what territory it will control. But there is this larger stake, and which means what kind of international order we will have. So one interpretation preferable for me, of course, and for collectively for the West, is that Russian behavior is some kind of atavistic. It's atavistic behavior. It's kind of pathology. It's pathological. Now somehow that term is not used, but earlier it was called that one would say that Russia is a rogue state. That was a term which was fashionable in early 1990s, when Iraq was considered rogue state, for instance, and some others. Now Russia is maybe that term did not work well, so it's kind of forgotten, but basically Russia, the West wants to make Russia pariah state, so it's the same. And because its atavistic behavior should be effectively punished, and that, of course, will teach a lesson to other potential imperial conquerors or aggrandizers, and the world will go back to normal. If the outcome of the war is Russia's defeat, or something that we can credibly interpret as Russia's defeat, then we will say that, yes, this narrative of punishing atavistic behavior was sort of correct. And there is a positive precedent not so long ago, and it was the war in Iraq, but the first war in Iraq. Of course, when we see war in Iraq, everybody remembers the second war in Iraq, when coalition of powers led by United States attacked Iraq per se, and that usually is considered kind of bad war, or criticized, including within the United States, that it was on the one hand illegitimate war, but also it was no less importantly, ineffective war. It did not achieve its objectives. It did achieve its initial objectives very easily. So Saddam Hussein was toppled, but it did not bring kind of peace to the region. That's bad. So nobody wants to see Iraq war as a positive precedent, but there was also first Iraq war, which was seen as positive precedent quite universally, almost universally, at least in the West, because there was the aggressor Iraq, which conquered its neighboring small state Kuwait, and Kuwait was liberating. That aggressor was punished to some extent, but not maybe properly punished, because then there was no regime change in Iraq, but at least Iraq was taught a lesson, and potential aggressors were taught a lesson that you cannot get away with just attacking your neighbor just because it's small and vulnerable. And so basically we can imagine theoretically that the outcome of Russian invasion of Ukraine will be similar, that Putin, like Saddam Hussein, like Russia, like Iraq, will be punished and taught their lesson. But there is another interpretation, of course, can be another possible interpretation, that wars of conquest are back. And it's kind of renormalized. They are normal again. And I don't like this interpretation as a person, maybe, but we should consider it because that's a Russian objective, that we consider it. In this interpretation, we would remember that during almost all of human history, the wars of conquest were normal. So Russia is doing nothing unusual. So empires were normal, and empires are created by the wars of conquest, by wars for enlargement. And the world was a world of empires. So that's how it was. And in such world, of course, the world of empires, could be no stable borders, fixed borders, basically. There could be natural borders like water, like ocean or sea, or very, very high mountains. That's possible. But otherwise, other than that, the only real borders were defined by fear of other empires. So if you are afraid of other empire, you agree on some kind of border. But if balance of power changes, if you feel stronger, then you dismiss that border and try to enlarge. And so the history of the world was the history of rise and fall of empires. So that was normality. It was not good, maybe. We don't see it as a good thing, but it was normal because that's how things were, and that's how people behaved, and everybody understood this. And that's basically narrative of many Russian intellectuals who are also supporters of Putin policies, that they say, oh, we are realists. That's a realism, you know. Whoever is powerful tries to expand. And of course, there are some also Western scholars. John Mearsheimer became much quoted, especially in these days, or Graham Allison maybe, and some others who also say that we are realists. And they, of course, do not justify Putin's actions in the same way as Putin on his propagandists, but still they consider this as a normal behavior, and somehow put the blame, partly at least, on the West, that it was the West who somehow provoked Putin into doing what it did. But generally, the bottom line is that what's happening is business as usual, as it were. And so my objective is to analyze also this assumption, because, as I said, that's the big stake at this war. Are we going to live in a war, in a world where we can say that this world of competing empires is over and the wars of conquest is not normal anymore? It's kind of atavistic behavior, or we are, with Russian war, basically going back to normal, because that's how it was throughout centuries. And in order to analyze this, I thought we should maybe reverse the order and do not ask why Russia is doing what it is doing, because in this theory, at least, Russia is doing what everybody was doing for centuries. It just attacks its weaker neighbor for whatever pretext. Who cares for pretexts? The reality is that it has to expand. So, so how we should ask maybe how it happened that this kind of behavior became unusual. Why it became unusual, why it was usual for idea, conventional narrative, as it were, that what changed in the last 2 centuries was that the world of empires was replaced by the world of nation states. So if earlier, until 19th century at least, empire was a kind of normal type of state. It was either empire or some small principality or maybe middle-sized kingdom or city-state, but the world order was at least defined by empires. And although small players were very vulnerable to empires and could be considered stable. But then now we live in the world, or until recently lived in the world, where nation state is a normal, quote unquote, normal condition. So we live in a world where the United Nations is a world organization, and the very wording of United Nations somehow presumes that this is a world of nation states, that states and the nations are the same thing. So how we came to this? So what was the precondition for this? And broadly understood, we can discern kind of 3 stages in this development until 19th century. As I said, empire was certainly the dominant mode of states. Then we had a transitional stage, which was 19th century and first half of the 20th century, at least, when this new idea of national self-determination and nation state emerged, but it coexisted with the world of empires. And then in Europe, in the West, there was this kind of curious hybrid, especially in the end of 19th and first half of the 20th century, when the same nations like Great Britain or Netherlands or France or Spain, they acted as nation states in Europe, but they also had great imperial holdings outside Europe. So there was this kind of universal imperialism of the West, but there was a very clear distinction between metropole, which was nation state, like France, for instance, and its empire, which was certainly not governed by the rule of nation state. it was some sort of a contradiction, but these countries struggled with it, and it was somehow justified and legitimated, not just by the power of the strong. I think in traditional world, you don't need to justify empire. You are strong, you conquer others, and they should just take it. If you are weak, you should be subsumed under somebody who is strong. In 19th century, there was invented this concept of mission civilisatrice, that you know, the West could impose its order on others because it was more developed, it was more civilized, and it was actually beneficial to the colonies to be conquered by the West, because this way they got the fruits of civilization. And that was the justification. But that was, of course, now, if you look at this post-colonial theory, they consider empire, a form of empire, as something Western predominantly, but of course it's not so. As I said, empires were universal throughout history. They were everywhere. Mongol Empire was also empire, but it was more or less last centuries that there was this big gap in development between the West and the rest, as it were, between the West and other countries. And so it brought, for the first time in history, some kind of Western domination. So the West was associated with being a metropoly, and other countries became colonies. But again, it's not, it's exceptional circumstance. It was not always like that. So the West, what was specific about the West, it's two things. One, that the West invented this kind of overseas empires that were metropoly and colonies are very much removed from each other geographically. So it's not contiguous empire, but also that eventually it gave up on empire. And so that this kind of hybrid empire, if you wish, that metropolis, nation state, but it has colonies. So this was a prologue for giving up on empire as a political form. And that's what we saw during the 20th century, when the West gave up on its empires or on its colonies, on its imperial holdings. And now what we see, especially in the last decades, it's now kind of in the mode of repentance. So it repents having had empires in the past and considers it's a sin, as kind of historical sin, that it did have empire. So there is this global change of heart and change of mind, that it's not only that empires are replaced by nation states, but it is also that empires were considered kind of immoral as a form. It's immoral to have colonies. It's immoral to conquer other peoples and keep them under your control. So in that context, what is unusual about Russia is that it's maybe the only empire which does not take part in this general mood of imperial repentance. It's the only empire, the only former empire, which does not reconcile, did not, or refuse to reconcile itself to this losing its status of an empire. And of course, it does not recognize its imperial past as kind of sin, as a moral problem with which it has to deal. No, it is proud of empire, being an empire, and it actually thinks that regaining empire is a legitimate objective. And that's basically very big value gap. And of course, everybody keeps quoting Putin correctly, his speech in Munich, 2006, when he said that breaking up of the Soviet Union was a greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Of course, you cannot imagine, Prime Minister of United Kingdom saying that breakup of British Empire was great tragedy, or French President Macron. Nobody can imagine him lamenting that, it was so great to have colonies in Indochina or Africa, and so terrible that it's no longer. And okay, they are Democrats, but one can say that Erdogan is kind of dictator or autocratic ruler. But Erdogan also did never say that it was geopolitical tragedy, that there is no Ottoman Empire anymore. So modern Turkey is based on the idea of rejecting an empire and saying that Ottoman Empire, Atatürkian idea was that empire was something backward and it was bad for Turkish people because this form was a bad thing, and so it was a blessing, basically, in disguise initially, that there is no empire and now there is Turkish Republic. So kind of nostalgia for empire, it may exist in some disguised shape. I think it does exist, but also in the West, in the Western former empires. But as I said, it's disguised and it's never expressed directly. While Russia is different, and it's totally legitimate, it's considered totally legitimate to miss the empire, miss the Soviet Union. Of course, Soviet Union, it was an empire in disguise. It was not empire in a classical sense, and Western Sovietologists did not recognize it as an empire. It was sort of bad thing within that Western Sovietological community to call it an empire. It was kind of considered right-wing or something, but now it's acceptable also in the West to call it empire. But here in the former Soviet Union, everybody called it empire. It was kind of matter of fact. Of course, this is an empire. And of course, breakup of the Soviet Union was the breakup of the last empire, at least in the West. But the contrast is that contrast between the West and Russia is that in the West, breakup of empires is considered as a good thing, and in Russia, breakup of empires is considered as a bad thing. So Russia is the only former empire that does not reconcile to this. And so the question is why? And again, I think in order to answer that question, I would focus first not on Russia, but on the West, because it is, if we look at large historical perspective and picture of history, it's highly unusual that empires kind of easily and voluntarily give up on their empires. And that's what happened in the West. I think, of course, these colonial people fought for their independence, and it's important part of the story that they fought for their independence. But in the end, okay, the metropolis themselves gave up on empires. They did not persist too much in trying to keep their empires intact. So it wasn't, okay, there was of course special case of Algeria and France, where there was some real fighting, and there was some fighting in Indochina, but that was less typical. In the end of the day, lots of countries were granted their independence peacefully in the end, as it was in the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union also initially broke up peacefully. Why it happened? Why it was so relatively easy to give up on empire in the West? And I don't time, I think, to go too deep into this concept of empire and history of empires. But when people talk about, I will very briefly make some kind of outline of this. Is that I will ask a question: what motivates empire? Why would anybody want to conquer other countries? Because it needs resources, sacrifice, etc. So why would anybody conquer other country? And usually there are three explanations. One is about security. So if you don't conquer other countries, then somebody else conquers you. In a world, this traditional world of predatory kind of states, it's very important to be a large state with huge army, because if you are a small state with small army, you are vulnerable, somebody will attack you. And so you have to have a large state with large territory and huge army. And then it is less likely that you will become a target of conquest. So it's quite rational idea to have empire, to have a huge state, to conquer more territories, because that make you better defensible. So there is this idea of security, it is the most, I think, in a traditional world, at least the most rational part of justification for empire. There is also a popular idea, especially among Marxists, which justifies, which explains rather, not justifies empire through economic gain, that empires, metropolis, and it's mostly about these Western overseas empires, that they gained some economic benefit from their imperial conquests. And in some cases it was true, I guess, because there were sometimes gold or diamonds or some resources in such colonies. But I'm not economist, but what I read, at least, of economic analysis, there is no conclusive evidence that having empires was cost effective, purely economic sense. It was lots of expense, military expense to conquer, get empires, and to administer it. And sometimes it was not at all, there was not much of economic opportunity in many empires. So in terms of cost-benefit analysis, it's not a very smart investment to have an empire based on coercion and military conquest. But there is also a third very important element of imperial motivation for empire, and that's prestige. Because if you have empires, if you have colonial conquest, it means that you are important. And I think it was very obvious, for instance, in the 19th century, when there was this competition between major Western powers to get more possessions in Africa or in Asia, so that it was a badge of honor or some kind of matter of prestige that, the sun never sets in the British Empire, or I guess in French Empire either. So it's kind of feeling of aggrandizement, feeling of being very important. Maybe it's not economically smart, as I say, but it increases your self-esteem, if you wish, to have an empire. So it's a matter of If you don't have colonies, then you are kind of second-rate power. So you need to have colonies. And so if we, in order to understand why the West gave up on its imperial status and imperial holdings, one should understand, or one should examine these three different motivations. So somehow these three motives should have been given up. And okay, if we start with the easiest one, economic part, then I think it's easiest because it became obvious over time that it's not worth it economically. From economic point of view, it's not worth it to keep empires based on coercion. It's smarter to give them independence, but keep good relations with them, keep them friendly for foreign investors, for instance, and you can still have your businesses there if they can have some, gains. Then these empires, these colonies will be happy actually to have this foreign investment, and whatever again these post-colonial theories may say, but these former colonies are very much interested in having good relations with former metropolis, as we see from British Commonwealth and other organizations, because they are hungry for foreign investments. Foreign investments, it's the best way for economic development. So, okay, it's much smarter. You don't need to keep your armies and, fight insurrections and things like that. So it's obviously better. Now about security. Does empire provide security? Okay, again, by the 19th century, especially 20th century, and the experience of world wars, it showed that, okay, having at least these overseas empires does not really provide much of security because, okay, you had, for instance, continental power like Germany, who did not have much of, overseas empires, but it had a really, really strong army. Yes, French and British people, British empires, they drew from its overseas empires with some fighters. Gurkha fought for UK, and Somalis guys fought for France, etc. But it was not worth it. I think the main thing was to ensure stability in the West, especially in Europe. And in Europe, the stability could only be achieved as a balance between different nation states. And of course, there was big ideological change, which was, I think, most important, was that democracy came in. The idea of democracy, with democracy and this idea of kind of divine right of kings and dynasties and monarchies somehow became obsolete. So, but if you want democracy, it is somehow linked to this idea of self-determination of states, and you cannot keep empires based on coercion and physical repression. Of course, World War I was the time of the end of empires in Europe. Within Europe, there were no empires anymore. Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up, and kind of imperial elements of Germany were taken away, and Ottoman Empire broke up, and Russian Empire temporarily broke up, but sort of reassembled itself in disguise as Soviet Union. Within the West, there were no more empires, but there were still overseas empires justified by racism, if you wish, that these are back peoples that cannot take care of themselves, and we need to civilize them. But effectively, it also contradicted values on which these countries were based, like Britain or France. Okay, they spoke about human rights and, you know, vote democracy and accountability of the government. And it's certainly contradicting having empires in and imperial possessions in India or Africa or in the China. So gradually empires also lost legitimacy, and legitimacy is, as we know, important. And there was, but last but not least, there is an issue of prestige, of status. So yes, you can think that security is your security does not require having empire, some colony somewhere anymore. Certainly you don't need it for economic gain. Certainly you can say that it's not legitimate to have coercive regimes anywhere if you are a democracy yourself. But okay, what to do with this issue of prestige? Yes, and it was painful. I think it would be wrong to deny fully that it was not painful for the British people or the French people to lose empire. So there was some kind of losing importance. And they were losing status also to the United States, which was always presented itself as against empires, and it was based on self-determination. It was kind of new nation which was seceded from an empire, for British Empire. So sometimes its policies are called imperial in certain indirect ways, but certainly it's not an empire in traditional sense. So United States became new hegemon of the West, and it was not imperial. So that was another reason why empire became kind of outlawed. But still, I was speaking about prestige issue for France or in Britain, etc. But while yes, they did lose some prestige as a result of losing empires, but they were still the most developed part of the world, right? So still Europe as well as United States. Europe lost in clout, United Kingdom lost in political clout, and France lost clout to United States, and they resented it to some extent, yes, of course, but still it was the most developed part of the world. Still the French fashion kind of was, you know, accepted, embraced everywhere, or the Beatles were the most fashionable, you know, and popular band in the world. So still Europe was prestigious. It was cool. Europe was still cool. And it was economically most developed, of course, and by level of life, quality of life, lifestyle was attractive, and everybody wanted to be like Europe or live like Europe or the West. So, yes, there were, of course, all kinds of intellectuals who criticized the West and said that it's decadent, etc. And now it's very popular, but still, okay, how migrations go? Like, does people flee the West and go to Africa or Middle East, or other way around? People from Middle East and Africa go to the West. The West is still prestigious. Its status is still high, and that helped the West to somehow swallow this bitter pill, if you wish, of losing empire and losing its imperial status and political clout and prestige that comes with it. Still, its prestige is high. And I would say that the project of European Union also helped, because European Union also presented itself as kind of normative empire or normative great power, which can compete with United States also, or at least so the saying goes. So that was also very important for the West, for France, for instance, to accept that it's no longer an empire, but it's kind of leading country in the European Union. As a leading country in the European Union, it's still very important. But the problem with Russia was, and here I will end. I know that I am already a little bit over this informal kind of 1 hour limit. So Russia did not have this this compensation. So Russia, with losing empire, somehow it lost self-esteem as well. And keeping self-esteem is very important for each of us as individuals, of course. We have to like ourselves, as psychologists and psychotherapists tell us, but it's also very important for countries. And the problem is that with losing empire, losing Soviet Union, Russia also lost self-esteem. Because before that, when it was Soviet Union, okay, Soviet Union was, of course, kind of objectively backward country in terms of, level of life, quality of life. Economically, it was not very developed. So life in Soviet Union was much more bleak than in the West. And that's why that's one of the important reasons why communism imploded and empire broke up. But it was one of two poles, right? It was a bipolar world, not bipolar, but yeah, bipolar, because bipolar is also disorder, right? So I'm a little bit confused about it, but it was one of two poles in bipolar world. So it was kind of on the military level, on security level, sort of on a same level as United States. So in that sense, it was respected because it was feared. And of course, it was the leader of, it had apart from inner empire, it was kind of external empire of satellite states in Eastern Europe, like Poland or Czechoslovakia and others. And they had lots of client states in the third world. And so it was very important. It was a very important country. And somehow what happened after, what was Russia after the Soviet Union broke up? It became, it got some kind of status of the third world country, basically. That yes, it had nukes, but it was underdeveloped, it was poor, it was unstable, and it was not respected. So what it lost respect of its neighbors, of other countries, but it also, with that, it also lost sort of self-respect, who we are. And so, of course, Putin and I think Putinism is based on this reaction to the 90s as time of humiliation, of national humiliation. So losing empire was unpleasant for Britain, for France or whatever, but it was not humiliation. It was not time of humiliation. It was, going from one state to another. But for Russia, it was time of humiliation, and it was very painful. And and this caused resentment or ressentiment, if we take this French word, which was used by Nietzsche, by Friedrich Nietzsche, to describe some state of mind. So he could not find a German word for that, so he took this French word. So this is kind of combination of envy, but hatred, but also self-loathing. So you look to somebody from below, and you recognize their superiority, but hate them for their superiority. And that's the West, of course. And so Russians recognize, yes, that in technological sense, America is ahead of us, but okay, spiritually, we are maybe ahead of everybody. And now it became very difficult to claim that, because somehow nobody liked Russia. So all these neighboring countries, especially I think it was painful, all these neighboring countries like Georgians, Ukrainians, and others started to look up to Europe, to America, and they no longer looked up to Russia. So Russia did not have this kind of important advantage in development. It had economic advantage, but it had economic advantage was because oil and gas, basically, not because in a substantive way Russia was more developed. This ressentiment was aimed mostly against the West, because the West somehow humiliated Russia, and that's the framework. So in this sense, this post-colonial war, or neo-colonial rather in this case, is also the war of ressentiment. There is not really, I think, very clear objective in this war. So whether it's annexing a little bit more of territory, but that does not really help much, because Russia has basically much more territory than it needs, frankly. But what it's lacking is kind of respect of others, but also self-respect, and that's what is needed. So basically, what was Russia's choice for regaining the self-respect was to challenge this Western-based order, so that the West is not only object of ressentiment because it's powerful, because it's economically stronger, militarily stronger, but also because it's hegemonic on a normative level, that they in the West somehow develop some norms that this is the right way to behave, and teach everybody else that, you know, democracy, human rights, whatever, respect for minorities, that those are universal norms, but they are the norms which were initially and historically somehow developed in the West, and they are advocated by the West, and they sort of teach everybody what is right and what is wrong. And that's especially difficult to swallow or difficult to accept. And so I think Putin's way was to position Russia as an alternative norm-setting power. So, of course, it's part of it is that Russia presents itself as a defender, advocate of conservative values against decadent West. That's very important part of kind of this project of regaining self-esteem. But it's also about challenging this Western idea of liberal world order, that the small nations can have their rights to define their own fate. You know, who said that? I mean, that was never the case, right? In history, historically, small nations had to accept what big nations tell them, and so Russia has to have its own sphere of influence or whatever it says. So, okay, there are certain nations which should be, you know, subservient to Russia, and it would be so unless America or the West defended these silly Georgians or Ukrainians or maybe Estonians and others, and say to them that you can decide your own fate. That's a silly idea, and that idea should be challenged. So I think this is this attempt to challenge the strong guy based on this feeling of ressentiment, which is the true motivation of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and that's a kind of it's veiled in this broader project of regaining imperial grandeur, lost imperial grandeur, which could not be accepted in Russia's case, differently from former Western European empires.